Okay, let's unpack this. We're opening the book of Jeremiah today. And, it's a book that can be really challenging. It's filled with these intense warnings.
It is. But I think what's so important to remember is that it's all rooted in um, this profound, fierce love for God's people.
Right. And our focus for this deep dive is on a really dangerous truth that Jeremiah exposes. It's the idea that religious confidence, that feeling of being safe just because you're near something holy, can actually be the most devastating form of self-deception.
And we're going to anchor this whole discussion in one particular incredibly vivid image that, for me, just sums up the entire conflict.
Where's the image?
It's a full family, coordinated domestic ceremony. But it's not dedicated to the living God.
hmm
It's dedicated to a powerful rival known simply as the Queen of Heaven.
That image is so shocking because it shows just how comprehensive this disloyalty was. This wasn't some fringe group.
No, not at all. It was the whole family unit. The children are gathering wood, the fathers are lighting the fire, and the women are in the kitchen kneading dough to make these very specific shaped cakes.
All while the city is pouring out drink offerings, it was completely integrated into the fabric of daily life.
It was. So, our mission today is to move through an essay built around Jeremiah chapter 7 and 44 and to really focus on the insidious nature of that compromise. We have to understand how proximity to a sacred place, the temple, can mask genuine disloyalty.
And lead to, well, catastrophic consequences.
Exactly.
And what the essay makes so clear is that Jeremiah doesn't treat this like, just some spiritual variety or multicultural openness.
No, he's not a modern pluralist. The core conflict, as God himself defines it in Jeremiah 7, is actually self-harm disguised as devotion.
Self-harm disguised as devotion. That's a powerful phrase.
It is. They thought they were securing blessings, securing prosperity for themselves, but what they're really doing was fundamentally injuring their own lives and their community's future.
So the call that comes from Jeremiah is, it's simple, but it's incredibly demanding.
It is. Loyal obedience and justice. That's it. If they reform their ways and their actions, if they stop harming the most vulnerable people and turn from these idols, God promises they will live in the land.
Okay. So for our deep dive, we'll structure our understanding around first the historical setting that allowed this deception to take root.
Then we'll walk through the biblical narrative itself, Jeremiah's confrontation. After that, its theological significance for understanding God's character.
And then crucially, the spiritual lessons for how we approach faith and life today. We really have to slow down and absorb the weight of Jeremiah's message.
We do.
So let's start by setting the scene. We're in Judah during the late monarchy period. Jeremiah is standing right at the main gate of the temple.
The very visible center of Judah's worship. This is the grand achievement of Solomon. It's the heart of their identity.
And he's preaching to people who are streaming in, they're carrying their sacrifices, singing psalms. They fully expect that by just being there, they're safe, they're secure.
And that expectation, that is the central delusion. You see, they rightly understood that this was the place God had chosen to set his name. That's true.
But something went wrong.
Over time, that truth curdled into a dangerous superstition. The belief that just chanting the words, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, guaranteed them automatic, unconditional security.
Regardless of their moral conduct.
Regardless of their conduct or their hidden loyalties.
It sounds like they were treating the sacred building like a magical talisman or an amulet.
That's a great way to put it. They relied on the mantra, the chant, and the physical presence of the building. And they divorced it entirely from the moral character required by the God who was supposed to inhabit that building.
And it's exactly that dangerous confidence that allowed their hearts to, bow to rival powers like this Queen of Heaven while they were still showing up at the temple.
And that's the tragedy of it all. They were using the temple's holiness as a shield. They could commit theft, bloodshed, adultery, perjury, all of that out in the city.
And then just walk into the temple courts and declare, we are safe.
Exactly. The building became a safe house for criminals, a sanctuary that, in their minds, just neutralized the consequences of their systemic injustice, and that fundamentally misunderstands the personal, moral nature of the God of Israel.
So, to break this false confidence, God gives Jeremiah this incredibly unsettling command. He tells him, don't look at the splendor of this new temple, look backward.
Right, look away from Jerusalem's grandeur and travel north to the ruins of a place called Shiloh.
The warning from Shiloh, this is such a powerful rhetorical move.
It's a profound object lesson, both rhetorically and historically. Shiloh was the original center of worship before the monarchy. The Ark of the Covenant, the physical symbol of God's presence, had been there for centuries.
Yeah.
And yet, God judged that site. He removed his presence. He allowed its destruction when his people, represented by Eli's wicked sons, trusted religious objects.
So they trusted the ark itself, carrying it into battle like a good luck charm.
Precisely. They trusted the objects and completely ignored God's voice and his ethical demands.
So Jeremiah is basically telling the people in Jerusalem, if God didn't hesitate to abandon his former dwelling place, the one that held the ark, he will not hesitate to judge your house, no matter how magnificent Solomon made it.
Exactly. It's a severe, concrete warning. And it confirms this terrifying truth that fidelity to God is based on covenantal obedience. It's not about geography or architecture.
God is faithful to his promises, yes.
But he is also faithful in judgment when those people, generation after generation, stubbornly refuse correction. God is reminding them. The structure of worship is entirely secondary to the obedience of the worshiper.
And the reason this obedience was so crucial is because the disloyalty wasn't just happening in, dark corners or secret meetings. It was happening in the family room. Let's talk about this idea of the domestic counter-liturgy.
This is perhaps the most insidious aspect of the whole compromise. Idolatry was woven deeply into the social and familial fabric. The Queen of Heaven, most likely associated with Astarte or Ishtar, a popular fertility goddess.
One that promised easy prosperity and, predictable results.
Exactly. She was celebrated not in some grand, distant temple, but right in the streets and homes of Judah.
And what makes it a counter-liturgy? What does that mean?
Well, liturgy means the work of the people. And this was the family's work. It was a coordinated, intentional act. The children, the most impressionable members of the family, they're out gathering the wood.
Right.
The fathers, the heads of the households, they're lighting the fires. And the women, who manage the kitchen and the food, are kneading the dough and shaping these cakes, often molded to resemble the goddess or some kind of fertility symbol.
Wow, so this wasn't just private curiosity.
No, this was a cohesive, rival form of worship that was actively reshaping the family's loves, its loyalties, its habits, right where life was lived, the kitchen, the hearth, at the most ordinary level of existence.
That detail about the family unit is just so powerful because it shows that loyalties are taught through routine and ritual, even if the ritual is just baking.
Yes. Every single time a shaved cake was baked for the Queen of Heaven, it reinforced a narrative. And that narrative was, we rely on this goddess for our prosperity, not the unseen, demanding God of Israel.
Which then prepares the children to think differently about ethics later on.
Of course. And later, when the remnant of Judah is in exile, having fled to Egypt, we see the tragic persistence of this inverted logic in Jeremiah chapter 44.
They actually defend the practice. They argue that it worked.
It's a devastating insight into human psychology. They look back on the recent disaster, the destruction of Jerusalem, and instead of concluding, we sinned and God judged us, they conclude something else entirely.
What do they say?
They say, we sinned by stopping the worship of the Queen of Heaven. And they literally argue, when we burned incense to the Queen of Heaven, we had plenty of food and were well off and suffered no harm.
So in their minds, their suffering was caused by the faithful remnant who tried to stop the idolatry, not the idolatry itself. That's a complete reversal.
The complete reversal. They mistook a temporary feeling of well-being, or maybe just historical luck, for divine blessing. They used apparent material prosperity as the ultimate measure of truth.
And the women were central to this.
The women, who were central to the cult, even insist their husbands approved. They're implying this was a broad social consensus, not some marginal vice.
And what's Jeremiah's reply?
His reply is fierce, and it's undeniable. The disaster fell precisely because you burned incense to other gods. Your stubborn refusal to listen, he says, will seal your ruin. They traded truth for a feeling, and the consequences followed.
This psychological failure leads directly to the most horrific ethical violation: the intertwining of idolatry and injustice, specifically in this place called the Valley of Ben Hinnom.
We have to connect the dots here. How do those cakes baked on the kitchen counter logically translate into the burning of children in the valley?
It's a very clear ethical chain. Idolatry fundamentally changes how we value life. The Queen of Heaven promised fertility and material success, often through manipulative means. You appease her for immediate gratification.
Okay.
When families rehearse that rival story over and over, the concept of covenant ethics, where life is sacred and neighbors are to be cherished, it just erodes.
So the moment you believe you can manipulate a deity for material gain, you begin to manipulate your fellow human beings for the same gain.
Precisely. Idols sitting on home tables lead to injustice spreading in the streets. Why would you uphold a contract if you believe your prosperity comes from a goddess you placated last night and not from walking justly before a holy God?
It makes the vulnerable, the foreigner, the fatherless, the widow,
Mm.
it makes them expendable.
Utterly expendable. And the ultimate horror of this devaluation of life is the practice at a place called Topheth. Detail the horror for us. They built high places in the valley of Ben Hinnom at Topheth, and they burned their sons and daughters in the fire.
It's a profound, horrifying violation. And the essay rightly points out that this is a practice God never, ever commanded. It violates the very nature of his law and his character. The depth of Judah's ethical decline is measured by their willingness to sacrifice their own children.
The very life they claimed the fertility goddess was supposed to promise them.
The very same, all in a desperate, cruel ritual to gain some kind of favor or security.
The judgment announced right there that the valley's name will change from Ben Hinnom to the Valley of Slaughter is such an immediate, visceral answer to that human cruelty.
It is. God's justice requires a stop to such evil. The dead would be left unburied, just food for the carrion birds, symbolizing a complete removal of human dignity and peace.
And the rebellion tore the fabric of communal joy so thoroughly that the sounds of the bride and bridegroom would cease from Jerusalem's streets, the ultimate silence of life. Yet, even in the midst of all this severity, the source material identifies a crucial redemptive through line. This is not just judgment for judgment's sake.
No, it's not. The severity of the threat God threatening his own temple and his own city, it operates within his larger sovereign purpose to preserve a faithful people through the judgment.
We have to remember Jeremiah's initial commission back in chapter 1.
We must. It included tearing down, rooting out, and destroying, yes. But it also included building and planting.
So the immediate ruin serves to excise the rot so that a future people can be planted in fidelity.
Absolutely. The discipline is designed to ensure a future beyond the ruin. God's ultimate commitment to bless a people remains even if this specific, stubbornly disobedient generation has to face the necessary consequences of their choices. The goal is always restoration of right relationship, which requires removing the rival loves.
Okay, so now let's move into the actual structure of Jeremiah's confrontation. It starts right at the temple doorway with the call to reform and the conditions for life. This is an abstract theology. It's immediate, actionable life instruction.
It really is. The message begins with this powerful ultimatum. Amend your ways and your actions, and I will let you live in this place. The core requirement is tangible reform.
And he lays out a precise list of behaviors that reveal true loyalty to God.
Yes, and they're entirely focused on relationship and protection. First, you must truly act justly with one another.
Okay.
Second, you must protect the vulnerable, the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. Third, you must refuse to shed innocent blood, a clear reference to the horrific acts at Topheth.
And fourth.
Turn from other gods. These are the explicit moral and social conditions for continuing to dwell securely in the land God had given them.
This list proves that God's standard is always measured by how we treat the weakest and most marginalized among us. It's like the litmus test of true worship.
It is. If you fail that test, if your religion allows you to abuse or neglect the vulnerable, then your religion is self-deception.
But they were living the lie, which leads directly to the den of robbers exposure.
Mm-hmm.
The lie, as we said, was trusting that temple slogan. So how did God expose the depth of their hypocrisy?
Well, they trusted those deceptive words that told them they were safe, even while they were systematically violating the foundational commandments: stealing, murdering, committing adultery, swearing falsely, and burning incense to Baal.
They performed these detestable things, and then they came to stand in the temple
And said, we are safe, safe, safe.
So they were basically treating God's house as a spiritual insurance policy against the moral decay they practiced every other day of the week.
Exactly. And God's perspective is chilling. He asks if his house has become a den of robbers. And that's not just a hiding place, but a shelter where criminals can regroup and rest before going out to commit their next offense.
And then he adds that line.
Behold, I myself have seen it. That is the definitive indictment against superstition. You cannot manipulate the sacred space or use it as an escape hatch from moral accountability because God is personal, he is present, and he is watching.
After that accusation, the sermon moves to the severity of stubbornness. The Shiloh precedent confirms that God is serious about judging the very house that bears his name. And the reason is because repeated calls for change just went unanswered.
And this is where the confrontation becomes devastatingly personal. The gravity of their condition is signaled when Jeremiah, who we know as the weeping prophet, the prophet of tears, is told directly by God not to intercede.
Do not pray for this people.
Do not pray. This is perhaps one of the most sobering elements in the entire prophetic tradition.
Why does God forbid intercession? It seems so contrary to his character of compassion.
It signals a boundary, a necessary consequence. When prayer is offered not with a heart of confession and a willingness to change, but specifically as a shield, a magical barrier to prolong ongoing, willful rebellion, it only prolongs the harm.
The harm they're inflicting on themselves and their community.
Right. So God refused to sanction a prayer that was actually enabling self-destruction.
It wasn't a refusal of communication. It was refusal to allow the means of grace to become a means of self-deception.
Precisely. The problem wasn't ignorance. It was active, willful stubbornness. Judah, despite daily prophetic warnings, went backward, not forward. They replaced God's simple, life-giving command, "Obey my voice and walk in my ways," with their own stubborn counsel.
And that meant the good, flourishing life promised by the covenant was rendered impossible.
Impossible.
So we return to that initial provocative question about the Queen of Heaven to understand the cost of self-harm. The Lord poses this central rhetorical question. Am I the one they are provoking? Are they not rather harming themselves to their own shame?
This is the definitive theological statement on the nature of sin and idolatry. Sin is not just a violation of some cosmic rule, it's an act of self-injury. The people thought they were gaining favor or fertility or prosperity by baking those cakes, but the only thing they were actually accomplishing was piling up their own shame.
And this harm boomerangs back onto the community and even the land itself.
Yes. The judgment God brings isn't contained to the individual or the household. It spreads across the entire creation, man, beast, trees, crops. It disturbs the inherent order of creation.
So when humanity refuses to walk justly, creation itself groans.
That's a theme we see reflected everywhere from Hosea to Romans. Idolatry fundamentally makes life unstable.
The prophet then directly assaults their dependence on ritual through this principle of obedience over sacrifice. I mean, they'd spent generations building altars and preparing sacrifices. What is God's devastating summary of all that effort?
It's highly sarcastic.
Yeah.
And incredibly ironic. He tells them, look, since you won't listen, you might as well just go eat your offerings at home.
Wow.
He is putting sacrifices in their proper secondary place. The initial covenant God made at the Exodus was not centered on piles of meat. It was centered on obedience that brings life and allows his people to be his people. This echoes that famous statement from Samuel. To obey is better than sacrifice.
So if the sacrifice isn't accompanied by a transformed life, a turning toward justice and away from idols, it's not only useless, it's an offense. It's an empty performance.
It's worse than useless. It's an insult. Because they're pretending to offer fidelity while actively committing betrayal. And this performance leads to the final, detailed portrait of defilement and silence.
The level of spiritual pollution was extreme. Detestable idols were placed right within the temple itself.
In the very house that bore God's name.
While the gruesome acts of child sacrifice continued unchecked in the valley just outside the city walls.
The announced reversal is total. The Valley of Ben Hinnom will be renamed the Valley of Slaughter, becoming a dumping ground where the dead are just abandoned.
And the silence of joy is the most heartbreaking consequence. Rebellion against the living God just tears apart the entire fabric of life, removing the sounds of the bride and bridegroom, the signs of future hope and communal joy.
It all ties together.
The narrative structure ties everything together beautifully and horrifyingly. The corruption began in the household with the Queen of Heaven cakes, was masked at the temple gate with false confidence, and it culminated in the Valley of Slaughter. The city was corrupted from the gate to the grave. So we shift now to the deeper theological principles that Jeremiah's sermon excavates. The entire critique, it seems, boils down to the definition of worship. Jeremiah 7 dismantles the notion that worship is just talismanic contact with sacred places.
And redefines it as obedient love. This is the radical correction that they needed and that, frankly, we still need. God's presence is personal and moral. He's not a localized deity or some kind of force that can be trapped in ritual or stone.
The temple walls, no matter how thick or magnificent, can't protect them if they fail at the most foundational moral requirements.
Exactly. Doing justice and protecting the vulnerable. The ruin of Shiloh proved that God reserves the right to withdraw protection from any place that trades genuine obedience for mere slogans.
So the question isn't, is God here? But are we living according to the nature of the God who is here?
Precisely. We can look to Psalm 15, which asks, O Lord, who shall sojourn in your tent? Who shall dwell in your holy hill? And the answer isn't the person who offers the most sacrifices.
It's the one who walks blamelessly and does what is right and speaks truth in his heart.
Worship is moral conduct, which leads us directly to the power of idols.
Let's elaborate on this idea of idolatry's shaping power. The essay explores the inner logic that we become like what we worship.
Mm.
So if we trust in something unseeing, unhearing, and unfeeling, we begin to take on those same characteristics.
This is a profound spiritual law, and it's detailed in Psalm 115. Those who make idols become like them, so do all who trust in them. The Queen of Heaven promised easy prosperity, but she was fundamentally manipulative and demanding. She required cruel, desperate acts like child sacrifice to secure her favor.
So when you trust that kind of power, you become ruthlessly pragmatic yourself.
Yes. If I worship a manipulative power, I become manipulative. If I worship a cold, demanding power, I become cold and demanding in my public ethics.
And this transformation directly impacts the city. When families rehearse these rival stories, when they prioritize guaranteed material success over covenant fidelity, they start treating lies as normal.
And the weak as acceptable collateral damage. The Queen's cult promised prosperity, but it delivered shame and loss. Idolatry fundamentally corrodes the joy in communal life God intended.
Jeremiah's sermon also helps us grasp the deep underlying tension between the heart and the law. He exposed the failure of all that external ceremony, the endless stream of sacrifices, to actually reach the will of the people.
They had the rituals right, but their hearts were stubbornly going backward.
The rituals were designed to function within a covenant relationship built on obedience. They were never meant to be a substitute for obedience itself.
Right. The sermon proves that if the will remains stubbornly turned towards self-interest, the external rituals are empty. They're even blasphemous.
And that failure of the external system is what points Jeremiah's readers toward the future promise of renewal.
This is the essential theological through line for us. Jeremiah's critique sets the stage for the hope of the new covenant. Later prophecies look ahead to God writing his teaching within the people and giving them new responsive hearts.
So we're talking about Jeremiah 31 and Ezekiel 36.
Exactly. The goal is to move beyond the failure of the external law to reach the inner person, ensuring that obedience springs from a renewed affection and a changed will. This is how a people who once went backward can finally go forward.
We must pause again on the horrific topic of justice and severity. The Valley of Slaughter prophecy reveals how divine justice must answer human cruelty, particularly the burning of children.
God is not passive in the face of such profound moral evil. He brings consequences that are commensurate with the crime. And that severity is not merely punitive, it's protective.
Protective? How so?
It halts the spread of evil and, crucially, protects the vulnerable from further harm. The lack of burial, the silence of joy, these judgments vindicate the nature of God who cannot be mocked by those who use religion as a mask for systemic harm.
So mercy does not mean permission to continue rites that literally devour the weak.
Not at all. Justice ensures the possibility of a moral future.
It's hard for us to reconcile such severity with the love of God, but the essay ensures we see the hope under the rebuke. How does this harsh judgment ultimately serve a restorative end?
The judgment serves to expose the fundamental lie of idolatry, that idols can secure life. By tearing down that false security, God clears the ground for genuine worship, worship rooted in truth and justice, which is the only thing that actually brings rest and renewal.
So the immediate destruction is a surgical act designed to save the possibility of a truly blessed future.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
God clarifies that enjoying his gifts in any generation is always tethered to hearing and doing his word. The discipline ensures that when the people return, they know why they return, and they know what obedience means: loyalty to God and justice to their neighbor.
Jeremiah's warnings, delivered outside that ancient temple gate, feel immediately relevant to our lives today, perhaps more so than we are comfortable admitting.
I think so.
The first lesson is critical: testing what we trust. What are the modern slogans that echo that old chant, the temple of the Lord?
Oh, that old chant can reappear under new institutional names. It could be the reputation of our organization, the size of our budget, the prestige of our platform, or the political influence of our group.
So when we rely on these external markers for ultimate security, rather than on our ethical fidelity to God, we are functionally chanting the same slogan.
Precisely. It's the idea that our institutional strength makes us impervious to moral judgment. We need to examine our own bow to powers like financial prosperity metrics, or constant public approval on social media, or institutional control.
The question Jeremiah forces us to ask is, Is our worship obedience or theater? Are we just performing the rituals while our hearts and our contracts are bowing elsewhere?
That's the question.
How do we practically test the gap between the two?
We test it through the application of the law, just as Jeremiah laid out. Are our public affirmations and our talk about God paired with measurable, verifiable justice toward the overlooked, the marginalized, the vulnerable?
Because the Lord who declared, I myself have seen it, is still watching.
He is. And he remains eager to heal when truth replaces self-deception. Honesty about where we are compromised is the necessary first step, because denial is the very essence of that dangerous confidence.
And this brings the application right back to where the idolatry started. The kitchen, the living room, the lesson on households as formative sanctuaries is so powerful.
It is. The family baking for the Queen of Heaven illustrates how easily our homes become altars to rival loves.
The family unit is the primary forge for desires and loyalties.
Absolutely. Today, that Queen of Heaven worship might not involve physical cakes, but it involves the daily rituals that prioritize financial security over rest, or frantic scheduling over communal peace, or consumer comfort over generosity. These habits teach disloyalty just as surely as gathering wood for the fire did.
So if the family routine is constantly bowing to the pressure of performance and consumption, that home is functionally an altar to a different god of prosperity.
Yes. And the countervision must be intentional and beautifully ordinary. It has to be rooted in the habits that anchor our affection in the living God, as described in places like Deuteronomy 6.
We need to cultivate a domestic counter-liturgy.
We do.
What does that countervision look like in tangible, modern practice?
It means making room for Scripture to be read, heard, and discussed, not as a duty, but as a rehearsal of God's goodness. It means prayers that actively rehearse God's actual goodness rather than just asking for material favors. It means cultivating generosity that actively protects the stranger, the orphan, and the truly vulnerable. These patterns, lived out over time, reteach desire. They create ears that welcome correction, preventing the next generation from going backward into the same self-deception.
Next, we have to revisit that painful instruction given to Jeremiah about prayer and repentance, being told not to plead for the stubborn people. This has to inform how we approach intercession today.
This mandate is a profound safeguard against confusing spiritual talk with spiritual change. It teaches us that intercession cannot be used as a spiritual mechanism to override the moral consequences of persistent rebellion.
It guards us from that destructive self-deception that says, I can pray my way out of the discipline I deserve.
Exactly.
So how do we practice wise intercession in light of this severe truth?
Wise intercession has to align with God's justice and his purposes. It prays toward the softening of hard hearts. It prays for the full exposure of lies and for the courage to embrace true obedience.
And it prays for protection for those being harmed.
Critically, yes. It prays for protection and relief for those most harmed by the spread of sin, the vulnerable people Jeremiah keeps mentioning. And we recognize that when rebellion persists, consequences are not merely punishment. They often become God's severe mercy.
The only thing powerful enough to interrupt the cycle of self-harm and force a reckoning.
Exactly.
Finally, we must embrace the courage of memory. We started with the ruins of Shiloh, and that image has to guide our future decisions.
Shiloh is a necessary field trip in holy realism. The ruins teach us what institutional pride and slogans try to hide. It shows us that God will indeed judge the house that bears his name if it persists in disobedience and hypocrisy.
So if we look at our own history, our churches, our families, our organizations, we have to have the courage to remember honestly.
We must. We need to name the seasons when God's clear warnings were ignored. And equally, we must celebrate the restorations and renewals. He worked when people humbled themselves and confessed their false loyalties.
This honest historical memory is what prepares us. It prevents the cyclical failure.
It prepares us to resist the next fashionable idol that comes along, teaching us to choose the good way, the ancient path of justice, obedience, and loyal love, which leads to the rest God intended.
Our deep dive into Jeremiah 7 and the chilling image of the Queen of Heaven cult reveals a critical, unchanging truth about the cost of compromise. Idols injure their worshippers. Sanctuaries, whether they're physical buildings or modern institutions, can become functional hiding places for the morally corrupt. And the promised joy of life in God's presence turns into silence and slaughter when his ways are systematically abandoned.
The call of Jeremiah is fierce because the stakes are human and they are holy.
And the message remains urgent for us today.
He does. God called his people to lay down the chance of false security, Listen to his voice, do justice to the vulnerable, and walk in his ways so that life in the community, life in the land might continue under his smile. True flourishing is found when our obedience touches our public contracts, our institutional worship, and most intimately, our own kitchens and daily habits.
Let us return now to the passage that grounded our discussion, emphasizing the core theological insight. The truth that idolatry is fundamentally self-harm. Jeremiah 7, verses 18 and 19 encapsulates this ultimate warning.
The children gather wood, the fathers light the fire, and the women knead the dough and make cakes to offer to the Queen of Heaven. They pour out drink offerings to other gods to arouse my anger. But am I the one they are provoking? Are they not rather harming themselves to their own shame?
This is the crucial, lasting warning.
Yeah.
Every time we seek life or security outside of faithful obedience to the living God, we are not punishing him. We are corroding our own joy and our communal life. True rest and flourishing are found only in the Lord of Heaven, who cannot be manipulated by cakes or chance, but who must be cherished in loyal, obedient love.
May you find the courage today to test what you truly trust, and may you choose the good way that leads to rest, that your renewed affection for the living God might transform your household, your community, and your life. Walk in his ways, for they are your good and your life.